It's hard to keep up with the news these days. One moment, we're grappling with global crises, and the next, we're faced with decisions that hit a little closer to home. Recently, the U.S. military announced that they're sending thousands more troops to the southern border. And honestly, it's a topic that stirs a lot of emotions and opinions, doesn't it? So, let's break this down together. First off, let's talk about why this is happening. The southern border has been a hotbed of political debate for years now. We've seen waves of migration, people fleeing violence, poverty, and instability in their home countries. It's a humanitarian crisis, and it's complicated. But the government's response has been to ramp up military presence, which raises a lot of questions. Are we treating this as a security issue or a humanitarian one? Because those two lenses can produce very different outcomes. Now, I get it. The idea of securing our borders resonates with many people. It's a matter of national security, right? We want to ensure that our country is safe, that we're protecting our citizens, and that we have control over who enters our nation. But when we send in the military, it raises the stakes. It's not just about border patrol anymore. It's about the military, and that brings a whole different set of implications. Think about it. When the military gets involved, it's not just about checking IDs or managing crowds. It's about enforcing rules, potentially using force, and that can escalate quickly. We've seen this play out in other contexts, haven't we? The deployment of troops can create tension, not just with those trying to cross the border, but also within communities that feel the impact of that military presence. And let's not forget the human aspect of this whole situation. Behind every statistic, there's a story. Families risking everything to find safety and a better life. Children who are part of this migration, who are vulnerable and scared. When we talk about sending troops, we have to remember that we're talking about real people, not just numbers on a page. It's easy to get lost in the rhetoric, but we have to ground ourselves in humanity. Now, I know some people might argue that sending more troops is a necessary step. They might say, we need to deter illegal immigration. But at what cost? When we militarize the border, are we sending a message of fear rather than one of compassion? Is there a way to balance security with empathy? Because I believe there is, but it requires a shift in mindset. Instead of viewing migrants as threats, what if we saw them as individuals seeking help? What if we invested in solutions that address the root causes of migration? Economic support for struggling nations, partnerships to promote stability, and humanitarian aid can go a long way. It's a long-term approach, sure, but it's one that could lead to sustainable changes. And then there's the question of resources. Deploying thousands of troops isn't cheap. We're talking about funding, logistics, and the potential impact on military readiness for other operations. Some might argue that this money could be better spent on social programs, education, or healthcare. We have to ask ourselves, what are our priorities as a nation? Are we investing in a future that reflects our values, or are we reacting out of fear? Let's pivot a bit and talk about the political landscape. This decision to send more troops isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a larger narrative, one that's influenced by elections, public opinion, and political agendas. And we've seen how immigration can become a rallying cry for certain factions. It's a tool for mobilization, but it can also lead to divisiveness. When we talk about the border, it's easy to fall into the trap of us versus them. But I think it's crucial to remember that we're all part of the same human family. We have to find a way to engage in this conversation that doesn't dehumanize anyone. It's not about denying the challenges we face, but rather acknowledging them while still holding onto our humanity. And let's not forget the impact on the communities near the border. More troops mean more military presence, and that can change the dynamics of local life. Businesses, schools, and families all feel the effects. Some might feel safer, while others might feel like they're living in a militarized zone. We need to consider how this affects the everyday lives of people who are just trying to go about their day. So, as we digest this news, let's take a moment to reflect. What do we want our response to be? How do we want to be remembered as a nation? Are we going to be the country that turns its back on those in need? Or are we going to be a beacon of hope and compassion? The deployment of thousands of troops to the southern border is a significant move, and it's one that deserves our attention and our thoughtful consideration. Let's engage in this dialogue, not just for ourselves, but for the future we want to create. It's time to think critically, to empathize deeply, and to advocate for solutions that reflect our values. Because at the end of the day, we all want to live in a safe, just, and compassionate world. Let's work towards that together.